This is the essential guide to the GoPro Hero 11 Black.
Yeah, and as professional photographers and videographers who do a whole lot of mountain biking, we are gonna cut through both the hype machine and the user manual like a hot knife through butter.
So your footage can go from
this to this. Let's go. Okay, so real fast before we get into these super important settings, we're gonna go over the body of this thing. There's a front screen and there's a back screen. Now, there is a huge difference between the two because this one, it might look like it's gonna be a touch screen, but it's not. Only the back is a touch screen, so keep that in mind. It's got a lens cover, which is removable, which is super great, and it is the same lens cover as the Hero 10 and the Hero 9, which is awesome. And when you go to take it off, I made the mistake of pressing down and turning, but you don't have to do that. Just turn, do not press down, or else it won't come off. But you give it a little quarter turn, and it pops off. Now on this camera, there are 3 microphones, and we're gonna go over audio, probably one of the most important changes you can make to this GoPro pretty quick, but yeah, 3 of them. That little dot right there, this little mesh right here, and this section right here. This is kind of like a water mic, so they make this so that water can go in and then drain back out. It almost looks like it's a door or something. Don't try and take that off. You'll break your camera. This is the power and the mode button, and that is the record button. So over on this side here is the door that houses your battery, your memory card, and a USB-C little charging area or a data port. And just so you know, this little door can pop right off. So make sure you don't lose that. And if you do break it off, don't worry, you didn't actually break anything. You just pop it back on and away you go. You'll notice we've got the Enduro battery. You can tell the Enduro battery from the regular batteries by whether it's white on the ends or blue on the ends. So this is white, which means it's the Enduro battery. They last longer. I only suggest using those ones. And then right there, you can see tucked away is the memory card. See if you can get that out. And that brings us to the actual memory card itself. Now, trust me on this one, just buy SanDisk Extreme cards for these cameras. I have tried so many over the years and so many of them have given me huge troubles and I've lost files. Whereas if you get genuine SanDisk Extreme cards, you're gonna be good to go. For this type of camera and the kind of data rates it's shooting, I recommend either a 64 gig or 128 gig cards. And again, make sure you buy these things from reputable places because there are lots of fakes out there and you'll get corrupted files and that won't be fun.
So one last note about memory cards, make sure that when you get a new card to put it in your camera and then format it in the camera. And every time you dump your footage, put it back in the camera and format it again. If you remember to format your card, it will help keep it healthy, which just keeps it from corrupting in the future.
And last but not least, on the bottom, there are the mounting fingers, they call them. Always sounds weird. Those pop out, and underneath those are not microphones, those are actually speakers. And if you ever break this mount, you can actually, there are little 4 screws right there. You can pop those off, put a new mount on, and away you go. Okay, into the menu system and some extremely important changes you can make to this camera. Okay, so we've got the fancy slash nerdy little rig set up, so I'm gonna show you real time as I change the settings on the back of this camera. And let's get things dialed in. And Beth is first gonna show us the all-important swipe functions, because without knowing those, it's gonna get frustrating.
We can swipe to the right if we wanna change our mode. We can also swipe to the left. When you're ready to view your footage, you can swipe up, and then it should start playing back. And I'm just gonna swipe down to go back to the main menu. To get into your preferences, you're gonna swipe down, and then you're gonna swipe back up to go back to the main screen.
Okay, let's dive into some specifics. Okay, so the very first thing you're gonna wanna do with this camera is swipe down into the controls over this way into kind of preferences, I guess. Pre-preferences, because there's preferences. I'm already in Pro Control, but when you get it from stock, it's gonna be in easy mode. And that, my friends, is not what you want. Especially if you're watching this video, I'm gonna assume that you probably want good looking video and audio from your GoPro. So the first thing you gotta do, put it into Pro mode, which by the way, was just normal mode on every other GoPro up until this one. So no big deal. Okay, and now that we're back to the main sort of screen that you're gonna see pretty much all the time, you can see all the main controls that you have here. And there are all these little buttons in and around the sides that you don't get on easy mode, but you want these. First, I'm gonna show you 2 quick things that just help on your day-to-day life with these cameras. One is orientation lock. Oftentimes your GoPro will be moving all over the place. With orientation lock on, the camera is gonna stay oriented like that. But with it off, which I find super annoying, as soon as you go like this, all the controls change all over the place. Pretty annoying. So I like orientation lock on, really helps with things. And the other kind of random but helpful thing before we really dive into things is exposure controls. So if you press and hold on the screen, it's gonna bring up this little box, and then you can control what kind of exposure you want. So I've dragged it into the shadows, so it's exposing for the shadows. If I drag it up here, it's exposing for the sky. So you don't always need this, but I find in some situations, like if you're pointing upwards towards the sky and there's a subject that you want to be exposed properly, pretty handy. Okay, now that we got the basics covered, let's dive into how to make this camera footage look real nice. Okay, so now why would you choose different frame rates, and what is that anyways? Well, that's basically the amount of frames per second that this camera is shooting at. So most platforms, sharing platforms, are generally show in 30 frames a second, so it's a very common one for people to use. Personally, I like 24 because that's a classically like cinematic sort of a look, but let's just say we're going with 30 frames a second. So you're gonna set it there just for good general footage. Now, when you go up past that into 60 or 120 or 240 frames per second, you're generally using those if you're gonna slow that footage down, either all of it or part of it. And so for example, here's a clip at 2.7K at 240 frames a second, slowed all the way down to 24 frames a second. And you can see how slow and smooth that looks. Okay, now here's a biggie. We are gonna go and look at the different digital lenses here. So where this is set up right now is on the wide lens. I honestly don't use wide very often. I'm usually on one of the more extreme sides of the spectrum for which lenses I'm using, and I'll explain why. So that's the wide lens there. Now if we move it one more to the wider setting, now we've got super view. Super view is a classic GoPro look. It's where they take a 4:3 aspect ratio and squish it down into a 16:9 aspect ratio. So you still get a nice tall field of view with all the width. And over on this end of the spectrum with Super View, and then now with the 11 black, we also have Hyper View, which gives you even more space on the top and bottom, squished down to that 16:9 format. Super View and Hyper View, those are very wide angle views that generally you use when you're filming yourself doing activities. So that could be chest mounted while you're mountain biking, for example, or it could be when you're skiing and you have the GoPro out on a pole facing back at you. You want to capture as much as possible, as much of the action as possible. Now, if you go to the other side of the lens spectrum, so we go down all the way to linear, that wide angle distortion is now gone. It's sort of punched into the sensor a little bit, and it is not nearly as wide angle as it was before. Oh look, there's Hunter. And now if you ask me, those linear modes, which are linear and linear plus horizon lock, and actually I'll show you real quick the difference between the two. I'll show you here, with horizon lock on, you'll notice that the image on that GoPro is staying perfectly flat, even though we're turning the camera. Versus if we were just on linear, everything is going with the camera. Now for me, both of those linear modes I find are for when you're filming someone else. So let's say, if, again, skiing, if you have it on a pole and facing forward towards someone else, you might want more of a cropped in field of view so that you can get a little bit closer to the action of the person that's, 15, 20 feet in front of you. And I find that if you have that horizon lock on, it really looks pro and almost looks like you're using a professional gimbal. Okay, this next setting that we're gonna change from the stock setting is maybe one of the two most important ones, if you ask me, and that is audio. If you listen to that full factory stock GoPro at the beginning of the video, you'll notice it sounds like junk. It's trying to compensate for the wind noise and doing all sort of fancy processing, but it just winds up sounding really bad if you ask me. But we're gonna change one setting and add one thing to this camera, and it's gonna make all the difference in the world. All right, so first things first, and don't worry, we are gonna cover all of the stuff that you're seeing me scroll past, but we're gonna scroll right on down to this wind function right here. It says wind auto. We are going to turn that to off immediately. The wind function on these cameras, on every single GoPro, and on every single action camera just sucks, so we're gonna get rid of that. But how do we handle the wind? Well, there's two ways that you can do that pretty easily. Okay, I just grabbed a Hero 9 that I had sitting in the bag because I don't want to take that one off the mount. We have turned the wind function off, and now we have to deal with the wind. Now, totally cutting out wind noise isn't necessarily a great thing either, because if you've ever heard like an action moment with absolutely no wind noise, it actually sounds really strange to our brains because we're used to hearing wind, flying past our ears when we're on a mountain bike or when we're skiing or whatever. So we want to cut it down. And one way of doing that really cheaply and easily is you order one of these little foamies. You can get them off of Amazon or off of B&H Photo or whatever. And this just slips right over top of the entire camera, and you can still access the back screen. You can see the front screen. You can access the power/mode button. It's all there, and it covers all three mics. You don't have to worry about it. And the sound is great. With the wind function off and this little wind muffler on there, you are set to go. And for me, what I did a little bit of a custom cut on this. I cut a little section out right there so I can still get at the battery door without taking the foam off. The other way that you can cut down on the wind noise, and you can see that I've modified this Hero 9, is that you can put, they're called dead cats. It's like a film industry thing. It's super weird. Anyways, you put little mini dead cats over top of the microphones. And I did have one on the top there too, but it fell off recently. Anyways, you just get little bits of sticky tape, put it in and around that mic hole, and you can buy these tiny little mini dead cats online, or you can just buy a big wind muffler for a microphone and chop it up into little pieces and stick it on your camera. And then that way it's always on there and you don't have to worry about forgetting that foamy thing. Either way, your audio is about to be 1,000,000 times better than it was. The next most important thing to change on your camera immediately, if you ask me, if you want your footage to look any good, is changing the white balance. I feel like most people just don't realize how big of a deal it is to lock in your white balance. We're gonna go over here and it says white balance. Right now it's set to auto. And if you'll notice, when it's set to auto, it gets confused because even a nice new fancy camera like this, it doesn't really know what's going on. And so if I walk over this way and I go and point it over here, if you'll notice, it just kind of went pale. And that's because, I mean, there's this beautiful, you kind of see around the edges of the camera, it's beautiful green moss, but all the GoPro sees is too much green. So it adds in red and it tries to even it all out to be kind of gray. And that sucks. So let's see what we can do about that. I'm gonna go back into the menu system, down over to white balance, and we are going to put it into either 5,500 Kelvin or 6,000. Now it's really cloudy out today, but I'm still gonna put it in 5,500 Kelvin. And what that means is the moss is green again. And that's because we've locked off our white balance. Now the cool thing about this camera that I've noticed is that when you set it to 5,500 Kelvin, that's pretty much good in mostly all situations. On a nice bright sunny day, it looks really good. Under general cloud cover, it looks really good. So the only two times you really want to change it away from 5,500 Kelvin, if you ask me, is one, if you're indoors in sort of that orange incandescent sort of light, you're going to want to change it over to match that. So you're going to go down to like usually about 3,200 Kelvin for indoor sort of orange light. Or when it's really, really dark out, super, super cloudy, you can go up to 6,500 to help warm things up. It's called white balance because you really are balancing out the color. But if you're filming things outdoors, I'm telling you, 99% of the time, leave it in 5,500K and it'll look so, so much better than auto mode. The other huge thing that we can change on this camera that can make it look so much better is matching the color profile with the contrast levels outdoors. So many times I see people riding in bright sunlight in the trees when there's really, really bright highlights and really, really dark shadows. That's a high contrast situation. And out of the box, these cameras are set to give you very high contrast. And so when you put those two together, that's when you have just totally burnt out bright spots in the image and super crushed shadows. And that does not look good. So in general, for general purpose situations, especially if the sun is out, I will go and I'll put it into flat color. And what that's gonna do is it's gonna give you more data in the highlights and in the shadows so that you don't have those super burnt out bright spots and those crushed shadows. Whereas if it's a really, really flat day like it is today for lighting, I might put it over to natural, maybe vibrant. Now, oftentimes after I've gone and filmed using the flat profile, I'll bring it into my editing and color grading software and I'll add just the exact amount of contrast on the back end, which you can do too if you like. You can also do that in places like Instagram as well. You can add a bit more contrast before you post it. So there's lots of flexibility there. Okay, we are most of the way through making your GoPro footage actually look pro. Next up on the list is sharpness. If you ask me, it's always best to set these things on low sharpness. There's always gonna be some sharpness that they've added into it. And so honestly on low, I think that's plenty, especially because again, I throw my footage into an editor and a color grader after the fact, and I'll add in a little bit. Now, if you go and try these settings out and you find you do want a bit more sharpness, you can go up to medium and that'll probably look okay. It tends to look a little crunchy in my opinion, but if you do want more sharpness and you don't want to have to do it after the fact, that's a pretty good option. Honestly, I would never, ever use high sharpness. There's no need for that. Okay, next up, and this is something I get questions about all the time. I've put out a couple of GoPro setup videos in the past for older GoPros, and comment section's full of people asking about ISO minimum, ISO maximum, and I always have my ISO minimum set at 100. It's a pretty standard kind of thing. And I have my ISO max set to whatever the highest possible ISO is. And in this case, it's 6400 ISO. Now that freaks people out sometimes because usually when you set a super high ISO, that means really grainy, chunky looking footage. But that's not what this is doing here. You're setting the maximum possible ISO. So this camera, if it's doing its job properly, it's gonna try and keep the ISOs as low as possible. And that maximum ISO, that's just you saying how high it's allowed to go if it absolutely has to. And if all of a sudden I'm riding in super dark woods, the sun's gone down, I want my camera to be able to push it to the very maximum ISO it can. Because in that situation, I'm not caring about the grain anyways, I'm just caring about actually capturing some footage that isn't pitch black. Okay, next up is EV comp, exposure value compensation. Now, what I find with GoPros and most consumer products is it tries to juice everything up. Everything crazy bright, crazy saturated, crazy sharp, and generally it looks kind of bad. So what I usually do is when I am in an environment like this, like in the woods in the summertime, I will go and I'll bring it down to 0.5 EV. So basically it's just telling the camera to expose just slightly darker than it thinks it needs to. Whereas if it's wintertime and there's bright snow everywhere, sometimes the camera will see that and be like, whoa, it's way too bright, and bring the exposure way, way down, and it winds up looking sort of gray and dull rather than nice and crisp and white. So in the wintertime, when I've got bright snow around me everywhere, I'll actually go to plus 0.5 or plus 1 just to help keep even out that image and make it look proper. Not too bright, not too dark. So you kind of have to trick the camera into doing that sometimes. All right, now, if you have fast-moving action with the things that you're filming with your action camera, which you probably do, one of the things you're gonna wanna do is turn the bitrate up. And when you do that, you're basically throwing more data through the whole system and onto that memory card. And the higher the bitrate you have, the smoother the motion is, essentially. So super low bitrate when you're flying through the trees, all that motion on the sides can look kind of blocky and chunky, whereas with a higher bitrate, the data throughput is able to keep up with that amount of motion, and so it just looks a lot more smoother and true to life with the higher bitrate. And also on this specific camera, we're able to turn on 10-bit color, which is massive, if you ask me, as like a colorist nerd. So we're going from, I think it was like 18 point something million colors all the way to 1 billion colors. And again, it's all about making things look smoother, gradients look better. The whole thing just looks a little bit more professional on 10-bit color over 8-bit color. And the last thing that we're gonna cover is hypersmooth. So back up to the top of the menu system, I've got it put into auto boost, which is another new feature with the 11 Black. And I'm liking what I'm seeing so far. It seems to be doing a good job. So what that's supposed to do is to be kind of constantly monitoring how much stabilization you really need to try and give you that widest field of view possible. So far, from the testing that I've done, auto boost is the way to go. It does a nice job. But you can set it into boost, just like solid boost. It's gonna stay the same crop all the time and give you pretty rock solid stabilization. Hypersmooth on, that'll give you a slightly wider field of view and a little bit less stabilization. And then if you don't want any digital stabilization, you could turn it right to off, like if it was on a tripod or something like that. And then you'll get the widest sort of full frame field of view from the camera. Okay, one last final tip for my mountain biking pals. Every single summer, especially in places like Whistler and stuff like that, I see so many people with a chest mount just like this and a GoPro just like this, and they've got it set up just like that. And they're thinking in that moment that they're capturing this amazing trail in Whistler, mountain biking, this is so good. But when they go back to their hotel room to look after a full day of filming, they're gonna realize that they were just filming the ground. And that's because when you're mountain biking, when you're on your bike, you're over like this. And if you'll notice, where's that camera pointing now? It's pointing almost straight down. So when using a chest-mounted GoPro like this, and you're doing something like mountain biking where you're kind of leaned over a bit, always have the camera flipped upside down, and then that way you can get kind of like a 45-degree angle-ish on the camera like that, because then once you lean over on your bike, now that GoPro is at just the right position to capture your handlebars and the trail ahead. A little pro tip.
So here we are with the Loam Ranger GoPro Hero 11 Black best settings. Feel free to pause the video and jot it all down.
So now that you've got your settings dialed and you're out there shooting amazing footage, don't forget to tag us over on Instagram
which is at Loam_Ranger_MTB. Yeah, we'd love to see the footage that you're capturing. And huge thanks for watching, everybody. Hit like if you found it helpful, subscribe if you want to see more, and we will see you next week.